Hey there everyone, Miss B. Hanley back again, and we're continuing our discussion about the Elizabethan times and William Shakespeare. So let's start with who William Shakespeare was. He was an English poet and playwright. He was alive between 1564 and 1616. He lived in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is a beautiful town. I have been there. It is very nice. And they have a whole Shakespeare thing. It's great. William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, and although she was older than him, she was also pregnant before they were married, which was a scandal at the time. She gave birth to 3 children, Susanna, Judith, and Hamnet. Unfortunately, Hamnet died at the age of 11, and it's believed to have been the bubonic plague. Then there was a period of William Shakespeare's life where it's called the lost years because there are no documents or records of Shakespeare's activities. These years are between 1585 and 1592. There are very little records about where he was during that time period. But then William pops up again, and he is an actor for Lord Chamberlain's company in London. He spends some time with them, and they eventually move into what is known as the Globe Theatre. Next, William Shakespeare became a playwright. He is one of the landmark writers of Western literature. So much is based on his work, things that you wouldn't expect to be based on a Shakespeare play. They're based on a Shakespeare play. And also, so much of his language actually carries over into modern English. Phrases and idioms that are being used in today's modern English were used back 500 years ago in Shakespeare's time, and some even conclude that he was the one who invented these phrases. A lot of his plays make humor even in very dark plays. He also has a very common plot structure of a dual plot, where there is a main plot between lovers or 2 characters that have a conflict, and there's also a subplot that continues throughout the play with the background characters as well. And this is seen in a lot of today's modern media. Shakespeare's plays are grouped into 3 categories. The first categories are comedies. They're known for that dual plot structure, but they always end in a marriage between 2 characters who were either fighting at the beginning of the play and have come to love each other at the end of the play, or something tragic happened and then they resolve the issue at the end through marriage. This plot is also seen in some of his tragedies, which is the next category his plays fall into. They do have dual plots, and there are some plays within a play where there are actors on stage who are supposed to be actors on stage, which is another really modern idea in media. But tragedies always end in death or murder. Whereas comedies will end in a marriage and have a happy ending, tragedies have more sad and somber ending. And the last is histories. These plays are based on actual events in British history and can often take characters from history like King Richard III or King Henry VIII and writing plays about what their lives would have been like. So there are some that believe that there is a 4th category called romance, and I'm not entirely sure if it constitutes as a Shakespeare category. There are plays that involve romance and lovers. Not all of them are tragedies, not all of them are comedies, but I think that romances is kind of like a thing that happens in almost every one of Shakespeare's plays. So now we get back to the Globe Theatre. The Globe Theatre is where Shakespeare's plays were performed back in the 16th century. Shakespeare called it this wooden O, which led scholars to believe that it was a round-shaped building. But they weren't sure because a fire destroyed the Globe Theatre in 1613. It was rebuilt, but it was demolished in 1644. In 1997, scholars and restorers came together to try to rebuild it again based on the evidence in the documents that have been around since that time. It's part museum, part theater playhouse, and you can visit it to this day and watch Shakespeare's plays performed in the actual theater. Going to the Globe Theatre, what would it be like to see a Shakespeare play? When a play is being performed, a white flag is flown above the theater, and plays are always performed during the day because obviously they didn't have electrical sound recording devices to enhance the theater experience. So they had to perform their plays during the day for the audience to be able to watch their plays in the right light. In England, there was a vast poor population, but these plays were marketed heavily to them because they were the main audience for these plays. The thing that people don't understand is that his plays were meant for the everyman or the average Joe. This was mass media of the time. All of these plays have humor that this population would laugh to, and when you think about it, when we actually read Shakespeare's plays and understand what he is saying, it is actually very funny. These poor people actually were called the groundlings because they stood on the ground to watch the play. They did not get to sit. They were packed into a sunken floor room where the stage was raised above them. They watched from the floor or the ground, and they were known as groundlings. Wealthy royals would often watch the plays, but stand so they could sit and watch the play from afar. This is the thing that's interesting, is that although there are female and male roles in Shakespeare's plays, there were no female actors. Men played all of the roles in Shakespeare's plays. An actor was seen as a fine occupation for a man, but would be crazy and scandalous if it were a woman. So all the men had to play all of the roles in Shakespeare's plays, even the female roles. Young men dressed up as women in order to play the female character. The theater itself would be pretty noisy, crowded. A lot of people in the groundlings didn't have theater etiquette like we do today. They would talk, they would drink, they would eat. If they thought something was boring, they would say it and throw food at the actors on the stage if they didn't like it. And it was an accepted behavior back then. So the actors had to project their voices and have very exaggerated acting styles in order to gain the attention of the audience and allow the audience to hear the lines and understand what was going on stage. Today, a Shakespeare play can take up to 3 hours to perform. Back then, they might only take 2 hours. And we know this from the opening prologue of Romeo and Juliet, where the character says, "Is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage." Shakespeare wrote 37 successful plays. He invented new words. He was really popular. Regular, everyday, normal people loved Shakespeare. But the mystery is that scholars aren't sure if this guy Shakespeare even existed. So here's the mystery to William Shakespeare, is that there were a lot of people back in the Elizabethan time that were writing plays similar to what Shakespeare was doing. There was a man named Christopher Marlowe. He wrote very similar to Shakespeare in the time period, and it was suspected that Marlowe and Shakespeare worked closely together and had done plays together or acted together. People think that they looked similar, which is a possibility. Marlowe could have been disguising himself as another guy, William Shakespeare, by changing his hair or whatever, but I'm not sure I totally believe this. There's another guy named Edward de Vere, and he's suspected because Edward de Vere was actually a royal during the time, but he was a great patron of the arts, especially plays and theater. So some people suspected that he was writing under a pen name and giving the plays to somebody at the playhouse, so he didn't want to ruin his reputation. There's this other guy named Francis Bacon, but I'm pretty sure that scholars have kind of like nixed that one. One of the biggest pieces of evidence that Shakespeare was not a playwright is that Shakespeare's tombstone is pretty famous. It's a facade of Shakespeare with a quill and a piece of parchment. But there's another facade of William Shakespeare's tomb that was found that shows him holding a bag of wool. We know there was a Shakespeare who was in a town who was a sheep shearer. And there is evidence that this could have been a relative, but it could have been the name William Shakespeare and somebody else using his name as a playwright in London. Obviously, this is all theoretical, and most scholars still accept that William Shakespeare is the original author of these plays. So when we're reading William Shakespeare in class, just remember that we are reading a play by William Shakespeare, and there were a lot of different interpretations and ideas that come into it. So when we read something that we don't quite understand, we need to keep an open mind, because we can learn so much from the authors that we read in class and the different languages that we can begin to translate in our brains. That's a lot about William Shakespeare. I did a long video about this because I really he's one of my favorite authors. I'm gonna be honest, William Shakespeare is one of my favorite authors. I have a bunch of books of his. This is a giant book of William Shakespeare. I really like Shakespeare. It's fun. His plays are interesting. His characters are funny, and it's just interesting to learn about an author who is so prolific in our culture and in our language today. We're gonna read Romeo and Juliet, and it's a good one. There are some great adaptations of it that we're gonna get to compare and watch in class. So I'm very excited to be talking about Romeo and Juliet this quarter. Make sure you're taking notes on whatever you could get, honestly. I mean, at this point, just, write something down and maybe like stick it in your brain. That would be really helpful. So make sure you're taking notes. And subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when a new video is coming up. Like and share and be good people. Don't leave mean comments. Leave a question or a topic that you want me to cover or that you're interested in. Read some really nice poetry projects this week. You got some feelings in there. I see it. I do. Like real feelings. Bye.